Hey, this is Dr. Stan and going to present a course on crisis counseling. Now, the course itself is based upon my textbook titled, amazingly, Crisis Counseling. But the lecture, of course, is supplementary to the actual textual material because anybody can read a textbook. We have a study guide, of course, that goes with the textbook. We have an exam that's based upon that as well. What we're wanting you to do is to be able to get an overview of crisis counseling, crisis ministry, trauma ministry. And so whether or not you're working as a volunteer, for instance, in a domestic violence training program, if you're working as a pastor or a lay leader within a local church, this information will really help you to understand how to minister effectively to folks in a time of crisis. Now, there's a lot of material we're going to cover. We're going to do it in approximately 30-minute sessions, and so I hope you'll take the time. There'll be a PowerPoint note-taking system that goes with this. Take your notes, and I hope this is going to be beneficial to you. Let me just start by talking a little bit about how to overcome crisis, because really that's what we want to see, is people be able to overcome the problems that they face in their life. I mean, problems come, circumstances always happen. Everything that we see in creation, in the universe in which we live, tends to follow patterns. And they follow things based upon principles. We find that both from a biblical or a Christian viewpoint, but just in the world in general. Finding patterns and principles usually can be then applied to different situations that, even though they may seem dissimilar, the patterns and the principles that are based upon foundational truths can still be utilized to help someone in a time of difficulty. The fact is, we spend most of our lives entering things and leaving things. We enter, of course, this world somewhat violently through the birth process. We start as being completely dependent upon our caregivers, eventually coming to the place where we're independent, or at least interdependent. We enter the childhood years, lots to learn. Teenage years have their challenges. Every situation, every circumstance of life that we face has its own potential crises. So it's important to realize, or to remember, that crises, if you will, is a normal part of life. And you don't define someone's life based upon an event. I mean, I do know people that have experienced life-changing crisis situations. They're life-changing, but at the same time, they're just situations that happen where adjustment is required. And those that have the ability, one way or another, to adjust to the crisis that they experience, the crisis itself can become a learning experience, a growth experience, or it can be one of the most devastating, detrimental, and lifelong damaging experiences of life. I think as we think about life in general, we all know people that have had difficult circumstances. I've worked for years with people that have been involved in child abuse, both the victims and the perpetrators. The only way you can really work with a perpetrator is to recognize that most of them were at one time victims of abuse themselves. But when you listen to the stories, you hear some people that they're angry, they're wounded, they're bitter, they're unforgiving, they're unrelenting in their desire for revenge. And others that seem to be able to not slough it off, not minimize it, but realize that, that was an event that happened. And my parents or the neighbor or whoever did the perpetrating, they were the ones that were disturbed. They were the persons that were wrong. They were the ones that that had the real issues, not me. I'm not being defined by what has happened to me. I'm not a victim. Some people take on victimization as their primary identity, and others recognize that, wait a minute, I can live life having gone through a difficult circumstance and yet not have it define who I am. You know, I think, even as you look at some of the ancient text of the Bible, there's a lot of people that started out in difficult circumstances. Moses in a basket. Now, he was raised in Pharaoh's court, which was pretty opulent and had the best of everything. But he spent 40 years in a wilderness because of his own crisis situation where he ended up killing an Egyptian. He went through some stuff. Jesus himself, think about it. The Bible says he was born of a virgin. That would be an interesting story to have to deal with in ancient Israel. At age 2 or a little before, he takes off with his family to Egypt, where a whole bunch of other babies are killed. Gee, I wonder how he got the inside information to know when to leave. Comes back to Nazareth, which was a town that nobody wanted to live in. It was not the nicest place. Anyway, and he was known as a carpenter. He came from Galilee. That was the second-class citizen of the day. And yet we know that he overcame. And everyone comes from somewhere. Everybody suffers certain issues and problems in life. How we adjust to them is really what determines whether or not we become a victor or a victim. Well, when you're working in crisis ministry, you meet people that are sometimes in their worst circumstance or situation. You don't meet them at their best. Now, again, I'm not saying that they're less than because they're in a crisis. And we should never assume that the crisis was caused by them. We don't know. You never know the circumstances. When you come upon an accident or upon a situation, you don't really fully know the whole story. That's why, and we'll talk about this, it's important to develop a significant enough relationship that you can hear their story and be able to relate to it and help understand what's really going on. When crisis comes, I think it's important to admit that things are actually out of my control. That's one of the scary parts or the painful parts of any kind of crisis, is that you feel your life is out of control. Now, one of the terrible misnomers in relation to that is the thought that we really are in control of our lives. The fact is, life happens, stuff happens. And again, one man's meat's another man's poison. One person's crisis is another person's opportunity. But still, when someone's in the middle of a crisis, for example, I remember hearing a man called for counseling, and the crisis situation was, my wife just left me. Now, there was a whole lot of things that led up to that crisis moment. But at the moment, that was the only thing he could focus on. Oh my God, what do I do? My wife has left me. My life is over. He was depressed. He was anxious. He was suicidal. He was beside himself because of this event that, quote unquote, suddenly happened to him. His whole focus was on the event. Well, a lot of times, when we are working with crisis situations, we show up at the event or shortly after the event has happened. And that is where we start our intervention with people, at the moment of crisis or shortly thereafter. We don't minimize the impact of the crisis. We're there, we're with them, we're present to listen and to help them in the time of the crisis. But the fact is that in most cases, there's been a long ramp up to the point of the crisis. Now, that's not always true. There are times where you're driving down the road and you're minding your own business and you have a sudden flat tire that takes the car off the road. You hit a tree and your family is hurt and you're traumatized by the event. You didn't cause that. the car didn't cause that, the road didn't cause that. It just happened. It's truly an accident. But accidents, in that sense, are crisis for people. So we enter into the crisis, and sometimes there was no ramp up at all, no one to blame, nothing to evaluate particularly. It's now, what do we do now and moving forward to help them in the process of recovery? So we'll talk more about that as we go. But anyway, we have to admit the fact that, we're not really in control of our lives. I mean, the fact of the matter is, life is difficult for many of us. And so when we go through a crisis, a loss, as we'll talk about, if we're going through a situation like the crisis of domestic violence especially, or child abuse, there's a whole lot of things that happen in the middle of that. And so one of the things you hope that you can bring to a situation, if you're functioning in a crisis counseling role, is a bit of calm. I mean, the one thing that you want to avoid is panic. And that's one of the first things that happens. This overwhelming sense of fear comes upon a person to such an extent that they're unable to function. So one of the things we try and do when a crisis happens is to minimize the level of panic. You deal with first things first, of course. I mean, talking about how they were raised in an unhappy family is not terribly important when someone is bleeding. You stop the bleeding first, you deal with the first things first, and then you move forward from there. But the goal is to try and minimize the panic. There's just the emotional fluctuations that come moment to moment in crisis can be overwhelming for people. And so it's important as a crisis intervention specialist, as someone, when you come on the scene of a trauma, is that you have a presence, if you will, of yourself that says, I've been here, I've done this, we know what to do, here's the steps that need to be taken. It's what reduces the level of panic. Panic, when someone is so filled with fear, they tend to make very, very poor life decisions. And in the midst of a crisis, you don't want to make really any major life decision. So when a crisis comes, we have to admit in some ways that our life is momentarily, at least, to use some AA terminology, unmanageable. And yet, especially I think if you're a person of faith, you can say that though my life is unmanageable, I know that God in His sovereignty can help me. And I know that there are people that are good people, that if I'm willing to, I can allow them to help me in my process of recovery. So, one of the things I tell people is don't limit God and His ability to help you. He's here, He's with us. Now again, if we're dealing with someone that has no faith, or at least a very limited view of faith, we may not want to be open about that. That's not really the issue in the midst of a crisis. But especially if you're dealing with a person of faith, faith is essential in their life, and helping them to believe in the goodness of God, that in spite of the circumstance, the problem, the situation that we face, God is good. And if you can help someone to grab a hold of that, that helps to reduce the level of panic and also helps them to begin the process of recovery. Ultimately, I think it's essential that we, recognize how humbling a crisis is. A crisis makes us vulnerable. And most people don't like vulnerability in general, but especially public vulnerability. The sense of shame, the sense of guilt, or of the fear, or can I be taken advantage of? It all comes to the surface for people. And recognizing the vulnerability is very important. I know that this is I mean, that's why really we cover people, not just to keep them warm, but we cover them so that they feel a sense of safety. We put a blanket around someone. We bring them hopefully into a more comfortable situation or circumstance so that they feel protected, they feel safe. Because safety is also very important in crisis. I mean, we don't want them to panic, because panic can lead to unsafe decisions. And safety is very important, or if you will, trust is essential in beginning the process of dealing with a crisis. So to be a trusting or trustworthy person, I mean, people don't know us when we show up on the scene from a stump. I mean, you might have a badge, you might have a card that says that you're somebody. I mean, when I show up in a situation of a crisis, part of it, I've got a certain level of credibility. It helps to be doctor. Oh, you're a doctor. Now they immediately assume that I'm a medical doctor, and I tell them, oh, no, I've got a real degree. But anyway, but what I'm trying to say to them is, no, I'm well trained, and I have certifications, and I have, years of experience. Well, that alone, that level of credibility for many people, helps them not to panic and helps them to begin the process of trusting and to overcome the vulnerability that they're experiencing. But you might say, but all I know is I've got my certification with Vision International and or City Hope, and it says that I'm a certified domestic violence counselor, or I'm a certified trauma specialist. Well, I mean, who knows what that certification means to a lot of people, but it does say that you have received training and equipping to help you. But really, the more important thing is you and your presence. In other words, it's recognizing that when you come on the scene, you have to, not braggadocious, but you have to have a certain level of confidence that I'm in the right place at the right time. And I can help because I've learned some things, and I know some things, and I've experienced some things in life. And when I bring all of that together, I bring a sense of empathy. We'll talk about that. To feel with people, to not condemn them, not judge them. I'm just here. I'm honored to be here. I really am. I'm sorry. I'm sad that you're in this situation, but you'll get through it. I know you will, because I've worked with others. Even if it may only be myself, but I've worked with others that they've come through, and they're better. They've worked it out. We're going to get through this together. I'm here. Your presence makes a big difference. It gives a sense of safety. It helps to deal with panic. And it also recognizes, yes, this is an out of your control situation, but as soon as we possibly can, we're going to get you back in control in a healthy way. If there are things to learn, we'll learn them together. If there are things that have to be overcome, we'll try and get you the resources so that you can do that. If there is long-term counseling needed, we'll make sure you get plugged into the right counseling source that's going to be able to help you. But right now, right here, right in this circumstance, we want you to know that we're here, we're present with you. And so, when you talk about crisis, I mean, it helps if you can define what a crisis is. And so let's do that. A crisis is defined as a change or a problem that seems to be beyond our ability to cope. I mean, a change is not necessarily a crisis. A situation or a problem that you figure out what to do to fix it is not a crisis. But it's something that is overwhelming to an extent that you don't have an idea of how to fix the situation. When our usual support systems do not work, we're thrown off balance. And in many ways, this is what we would call a crisis. And crises occur and can occur in all parts of life. And frankly, we should expect that we're going to have some of them in our lives. It's essentially inevitable. Things like the death of a spouse, divorce, physical problems, marital issues. I mean, criminal or legal problems happen in life. And then there's just the situational, but also developmental crises. Developmentally, it's not as though childhood is a crisis, but trust me, if you've been married for a couple of years and your first child comes into the home, it's like a crisis, and there's adjustments that have to be made. As children get ready to go to school, it can be a crisis for many parents. Teenage years can be filled with crises. An empty nest, and of course the end of life issues can lead to opportunities for crisis to come. There's a Chinese character for crisis. It's made up of two symbols, one for despair, the other for opportunity. And really in every crisis situation, there is both possibilities. Now, who determines it? It's not necessarily the level of crisis, but it's normally the response that we have to crisis. And again, if you're a crisis worker, what you're hoping for is to help them avoid the despair, the sense of hopelessness that because of what has happened, life as we've known it is done, and hopefully to grab a hold of and embrace the thought that it's going to open the doors, the crisis, for new opportunity. You may not want to say that when you first meet someone. It's kind of like some of the cliches people give when someone passes away. Oh, God needed another angel. Oh, well, thanks, God. I needed my husband. I needed my wife. I don't think you could create another angel if you wanted. Oh, they're in a better place. Oh, yeah, well, I'd like for you to be in the better place. I mean, those are things that people say because they don't know what to say. I mean, there are things that should be said, and oftentimes the best thing you can say to a person is nothing. It's to be present with them. It's to listen to them. As I've said in other sessions, in other courses, there's a reason why God created us with 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we listen twice as much as we talk. Crisis has 4 common factors. It starts with what we call a hazardous event. Something happens. I mean, that's the crisis. It's an accident. It's an announcement. I'm getting divorced, or my spouse passed away. Something. There's a hazardous event. The hazardous event has to be hazardous enough that it completely destabilizes the person, at least for a season. And so it leads to that sense of vulnerability, or a vulnerable state, a place where, although I may have experienced a wounding in the crisis, I could get even more wounded because of the crisis. There's a sense of real vulnerability. And that vulnerability, people respond different to feeling vulnerable. Some are more passive, some are more aggressive, some are a little passive-aggressive in it. Some people withdraw, some people pursue help. It just depends upon the individual. You never quite know how someone's going to respond or react to situations until you're in it. There's usually precipitating factors. That is, there are things that have happened to lead up to the crisis situation. I mean, I was dealing with a single mom who had a teenage daughter. At 16 years of age, she ran away from home. She wasn't really running away from, she was running to something. She was not running from her mother particularly. She was more running to a young man that, she wanted to have a relationship with. The relationship, though, between the mother and the daughter had not been open. It had a lot of healthy communication. Mom was still significantly depressed over the divorce that she had experienced. Felt like her life was not very meaningful, and she felt very sorry for herself, and thus, in her own words, she was somewhat neglectful, unattentive to her daughter. The daughter kind of found her own way to survive in life. All of those are precipitating factors that led up to the boom, I'm running away, I don't want to live here anymore. That was the crisis that they were experiencing. But the precipitating factors can help you to understand a little bit how this thing happened, not necessarily that you're going to address it at the moment, but it is something that will need to be addressed eventually if growth is going to happen moving forward in life. Again, not every crisis, not every situation has precipitating factors. Sometimes you're just in the wrong place at the right time. And there's still things to learn about that perhaps, but not everything is, again, somebody's fault or caused by precipitating events. But most of the time there is. And then fourth is the state of active crisis, which is, again, the feelings of panic, of loss that go with the crisis situation. You know, the symptoms of someone in crisis can vary significantly, from depression to headaches to anxiety to, physical or psychosomatic disorders, bleeding ulcers, a sense of panic, of defeat. Again, the person in crisis may feel absolutely defeated, overwhelmed, and helpless. And again, there are different ways that people respond to those feelings. But the two primary ways that people respond is they either become very agitated and unproductive in their behavior, or they become apathetic. And apathetic is they, again, become somewhat hopeless in that sense. The efficiency level of the person becomes less because of the crisis. Their ability to problem solve becomes less. They don't necessarily use healthy logic in the midst of the crisis. They just want the thing to get fixed. They want to be comforted. They want something that's going to make it all better. In many cases, they're looking for magic. And if you've been called on the scene, again, if you're considering, for instance, a domestic violence situation, you're called on the scene to try and bring some care and comfort and help with safety planning and all of that. The person may be so disoriented they can't fully participate in the process. So you got to develop relationship. You have to help build them up, strengthen them to be able to make healthy decisions so that they can do what has to be done in the midst of the crisis situation. And so, much of their ability to respond in healthy ways is diminished because of the crisis that they've experienced. So how persons react to crisis depends on many, many things, many factors in reality. For instance, who are they related to? Do they have a healthy support network? Are they well connected with family? What are their coping mechanisms, and what have they tried in the past to deal with problems or situations? Do they use rationalization? Do they have a lot of denial? Do they pray? What kind of coping mechanisms? What ways do they deal with problems? Those are things that, to be aware of them, can be very helpful. Because what's worked in the past may work in the present and could work for the future. We must recognize that the crisis time has a limited duration. And what will turn it into a series of crises is whether or not someone really resolves the crisis well that they're presently experiencing. In most cases, a crisis and the ramifications of a crisis shouldn't take any longer than 5 to 6 weeks before someone is able to stabilize their life or begin the process of getting back on the horse, as it were. But that varies for each individual. And so as you're working with folks, as you're trying to help them in time of crisis, recognize their level of vulnerability. Recognize their need for stability to deal with issues so that there isn't a panic response. And help them in the balancing factors of recognizing that you have coped with things in the past, you will be able to cope with things in the future. So in coming on the scene and in stepping into a counseling situation with somebody in crisis, there are several things that a person really needs. There are those, but everyone is different in terms of what they actually need and how they express what it is they need. There will be those who want a strong person to protect and control them. So if you have a victim who has been abused or neglected, and they feel this sense of absolute crisis and terror and I don't know what to do, some people, they want you to come alongside of them and kind of take control. Now again, there's a seductive aspect to that. not a sexually seductive, but seductive in the sense that, if you like that, if you like helping people a lot and you like controlling things a lot, then it's easy to get kind of sucked into a role of being the caretaker of this person. We're not caretakers, we're caregivers. There's a big difference, and you have to be careful about that. And that's why it's helpful to have, people that have done crisis ministry and counseling over a long period of time to help you when you're beginning out the process, if you will, of being involved in trauma ministry. There will be those who need to maintain, again, contact with reality because they're so shocked they're not even sure what's going on around them. There will be those who feel empty and need loving. Again, we can say loving words, and the ministry, if you will, of presence is a part of what we're about. There will be those who need a counselor for a feeling of security. And just having someone, to talk to is really helpful for a lot of people. There will be those that have obsessive thoughts regarding the crisis and what led up to it. Perhaps a lot of guilt or shame, and they want to confess. Well, what's shared with you in the midst of crisis, if you're in the role of a counselor, you must, if at all possible, keep that confidential. Now, there are situations where confidentiality cannot be kept. In the cases of if someone is suicidal, you have a duty, essentially, it's a moral duty, not a legal one, because you're not a licensed therapist, but still it's a moral duty to warn and to protect them. Someone is saying, that's it, I know who did this to me and I'm going to kill them, and they really have not just words but intent and means to make that happen. Well, then you need to warn the person and or at least get perhaps the police involved. And of course, in cases of child abuse, you can't not share that, because the children are by far more innocent, and thus confidentiality is not only not required, it's not healthy. We need to be able to protect children at all cost. And so there'll be those who urgently need to talk things out. There'll be those who desire advice on pressing issues. They'll have different needs, and as you listen to them, you can maybe take a few notes and realize the things that they need, but it's not necessarily the things that are best for you to give. That's where your common sense and ability to kind of diagnose what's going on in the situation becomes very important. Those who seek to sort out their conflicting ideas are also a part of the needs that people often have. There'll be those that want to seek self-understanding. They want insight. And part of it comes, why did this happen to me? And why am I in this situation? And they want to figure it all out. There are others that simply need medical help because they're in pain, and they don't really care about talking about much until I can get my pain under control. Now, again, you're not a physician, but if that's what they need, then we need to get them EMT or whatever is necessary to help them to overcome their pain. There'll be those that need economic assistance. And it might be tempting for you to help in that regard, but it's rarely a good idea to take from your own resources. It's better to do things through an organization. So if you're a part of an organization that does give some economic grants, well, feel free to donate to that. But you personally, I'm not talking about buying a cup of coffee, but where they're saying, if I could just get someone to pay my electric bill, life would be okay. Again, they need to go through